The December wind sliced through London like a knife, sharp and unapologetic, tugging at scarves and freezing fingertips. Among the blur of city traffic and the impatient hum of commuters, a sleek black Bentley idled at a red light near St. Mary's Hospital. Inside sat Edward Langley, a tech magnate in his mid-30s, whose name carried weight across boardrooms and stock exchanges alike. But not in the ways that truly mattered. Grief clung to him like frost on a window pane. His father had just passed and his mother had been gone since he was 8. Now, despite his billions, Edward Langley was utterly, devastatingly alone. As he sat lost in thought, the quiet tap on his window didn't just interrupt, it pierced. He turned to see a tiny girl no older than 5 standing on tiptoes, cheeks pink from cold, hair tucked beneath a knitted cap far too thin for the weather. She clutched a threadbare cloth in one hand and gave him a hopeful, lopsided smile. "Mister," she said through the glass, "can I clean your window for £5? My mummy's in hospital and I want to help." Edward blinked, stunned by the sheer weight of her words. The child, who later introduced herself as Elsie, was scrubbing windshields alone on a bitter morning, not out of mischief, but desperation. Her hands were red from the cold, yet precise, careful. When she finished, Edward offered her a £20 note. She refused, asking only for the 5 she'd earned. "It's for helping, not begging," she said. His heart, long silent, stirred. As Elsie turned to leave, she handed him a crumpled note. It read simply, in a child's handwriting, "Please God, send us a miracle." Then she whispered, "Mummy says we all have a guardian angel. I think you might be mine," and disappeared into the crowd. That moment stayed with Edward like a splinter in his soul. Back in his glass-walled office high above the Thames, surrounded by everything but meaning, her voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't the money that haunted him, nor the cold. It was the truth in her eyes. He needed to find her, to understand why a child so small bore a burden so heavy. And so began the search for Elsie Dawson and her mother Natalie, a woman holding on by threads of hope in a world that had quietly forgotten her. Edward didn't know it yet, but what began as an impulse would soon transform his life in ways he never imagined. Because sometimes, a little girl's whispered hope is all it takes to awaken the miracle inside a man who thought he had nothing left to give. Edward Langley hadn't planned on returning to St. Mary's Hospital, not after the day he first saw little Elsie on that icy street corner. But something had shifted in him since that morning, something deep, unsettling, yet strangely necessary. The little girl had done more than clean his window. She had wiped the fog off his soul, revealing a part of himself he'd long buried under luxury, power, and grief. He hadn't smiled in months, maybe years. But something about her grit, her honesty, her refusal to take more than £5 because, as she said, "It's for helping, not begging," had cracked his carefully constructed world wide open. Back in his office, high above the River Thames, the city's chaos spread out beneath him, just as hollow as ever. He called his assistant Abigail and asked for a favor that would have raised eyebrows in any other setting. "Find her," he said. "The girl. She's out near St. Mary's S. Her name's Elsie." Abigail, perceptive and loyal, didn't ask questions. Within the hour, she returned with a slim folder. Elsie Dawson, age 5. Mother, Natalie Dawson. Residence, a council estate less than half a mile from the hospital. Diagnosis, end-stage kidney failure. No spouse, no extended family listed. Edward sat in silence as he read. Natalie had once illustrated children's books, mainly freelance jobs. There was a photograph included, grainy but enough to see a woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle sadness. Her smile was thin, worn down by illness, but still somehow graceful. His breath caught when he saw a copy of a hospital intake form. She'd been in and out of St. Mary's for over 2 weeks, and her daughter was cleaning windscreens in the freezing cold just to help. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. For once, it wasn't the silence of his empty flat that kept him awake, but the knowledge that someone out there, someone beautiful and kind, was fighting alone. Not because she chose to, but because life had backed her into a corner. And somehow, fate had handed him the key. The next morning, Edward traded in his bespoke suit for jeans and a plain jumper. No driver, no fuss. He entered the hospital as just another visitor, telling the front desk he was with a local outreach program for artistic patients. They led him to Ward 2B, room 207. He didn't expect to feel so nervous. When he stepped into the room, there she was, Natalie Dawson, propped up in bed, pencil in hand, sketching a fox and a girl beneath a snow-covered tree. Her hands trembled, but her strokes were sure. Edward paused, unsure whether to speak or simply watch. When he finally cleared his throat, she looked up, startled, then offered a tired but warm smile. "I didn't hear anyone come in," she said. "I'm Edward," he replied quickly. "But you can call me Ned. I visit patients who draw. I heard you used to illustrate children's books." Her eyes lit up just faintly. "Used to, still do, when my hands allow it." Over the next hour they talked, not like strangers, but like two people used to carrying heavy things silently, finally laying them down. Natalie spoke of Elsie, her strength, her wild imagination, her certainty that miracles were still possible. "She said an angel was coming," Natalie laughed gently. "Not a nurse or a social worker, someone unexpected. I didn't take her seriously, of course, but she's always been a dreamer." Edward, Ned, as she knew him, felt that weight again in his chest. Elsie had told him he might be her angel. What if she wasn't wrong? Before he left, Natalie reached for a folder beside her bed and showed him some sketches. Dreamy, magical illustrations filled with color and wonder. Among them was one that stopped him cold. A little girl in a winter coat holding hands with a man in a long black coat and silver watch. His face was turned, but the likeness, his stance, the tenderness in his posture, was undeniable. "She said she saw it in a dream," Natalie murmured, "that the man who would help us looked like that." Edward blinked, barely breathing. He was wearing that same coat, that same watch. "May I keep this one?" he asked, voice quiet. Natalie hesitated, then smiled. "I think it was always meant for you." Edward walked out of that room, changed, not entirely sure what he was becoming, but certain that for the first time in years, he was stepping into the life he was always meant to lead. The following morning, Edward Langley returned to St. Mary's Hospital, the sketch of himself and Elsie folded neatly in his coat pocket. The night before had been restless, haunted not by nightmares but by something far more powerful, hope. He couldn't shake the image of Natalie Dawson, pale and tired, yet still drawing beauty into existence from her hospital bed. There was a quiet dignity to her, a grace that refused to fade, even as her body weakened. And there was Elsie, fierce, kind-hearted, and certain that the universe would send a miracle. It had been years since Edward had believed in anything intangible, but suddenly belief didn't feel so foolish anymore. Natalie had unknowingly carved her way into his heart with each word she'd spoken and each story she'd told. She hadn't treated him like a tech billionaire or a man to be impressed. She didn't even know who he really was. To her, he was simply Ned, the stranger who liked fairy tales and offered soup. There was a gentleness in their conversations that he hadn't experienced in decades. They spoke of children's books, of illustrations that carried messages for little minds, and of Elsie's quiet bravery. How she saved every coin she earned washing windows, how she refused charity, and how she insisted miracles were real. Edward found himself lingering longer each time he visited. He started bringing Natalie sketch pads and new pencils. He brought Elsie children's books and hot chocolate. They talked for hours, and as the hospital's sterile white walls closed in around them, their laughter, quiet, warm, and frequent, pushed those walls gently back. He told Natalie stories he'd never told anyone, about his mother's death when he was just a boy, about how no one could meet his father's eyes when the bad news came, about how he built a life made of money because it was easier than building one made of trust. And she listened, really listened, not with pity but with empathy. She didn't offer platitudes or advice. She simply said, "That must have been so lonely." And in that moment, Edward felt seen, not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man who had spent too long hiding in plain sight. The weeks slipped by in a kind of soft blur. He began canceling meetings, ignoring his mobile, even skipping international conferences. No one in the business world could reach him, and to his surprise, he didn't care. The real world, the one he'd buried himself in, felt hollow compared to the quiet room on Ward 2B, where Natalie's eyes sparkled with mischief and Elsie's laughter echoed in the hallways. But amidst the laughter, a shadow grew. Natalie's condition was worsening. Her hands shook more violently now, her energy dwindled, and the dark circles under her eyes deepened. Then came the moment Edward had dreaded, when the doctor pulled him aside and, with careful clinical detachment, said Natalie had less than 30 days without a kidney transplant. She was on the transplant registry, yes, but due to her rare blood type, her chances were slim. Time was running out. Edward didn't speak. He simply nodded, then left the hospital and walked into the night like a ghost. The decision, when it came, was silent and absolute. He returned to St. Mary's the following evening and asked the lab to test him as a potential donor. He gave a fake name. No press, no fanfare. Just a man trying to be useful. 2 days later, the results arrived. He was a match, a perfect one. The odds were impossibly small, but the truth was undeniable. He could save her life. There was only one catch. For the hospital to proceed, he would have to reveal who he really was. He could no longer be Ned, the soft-spoken volunteer. He would have to be Edward Langley, billionaire CEO. And that terrified him, because Natalie, this woman who had offered him nothing but honesty, might feel betrayed. She might think everything he had done was charity. Worse, she might not forgive him. He spent the night sitting beside her hospital bed as she slept, her breathing faint and shallow. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, half filled with drawings of snowy forests, fireflies, and a little girl in a knit hat. And there, on the last page, was another drawing of the tall man in the long coat. Him. He took a deep breath, turned to a blank page and wrote a letter. Not to impress, not to explain, but simply to be honest. When he finished, he folded the letter, slipped it between the pages and left, his decision made. He would give her his kidney, not to be a hero, not for recognition, but because she had already given him something far more valuable, the belief that he could be more than his wealth, that he could be someone's miracle too. Natalie Dawson had always found refuge in her illustrations. Even as her body weakened and the world around her closed in, her sketchpad remained a portal to a gentler place, where little girls danced with foxes in snow-covered forests, and the sky held promises of warmth just beyond the horizon. But now, as the hospital lights dimmed each evening and the machines hummed softly beside her, even the act of drawing had grown painful. Her hands trembled too much, her vision blurred, and somewhere in her heart, she feared she wouldn't live long enough to give Elsie the life she deserved. And yet something had changed. A man named Ned had entered her room one morning under the pretext of being part of a volunteer program for artistic patients. He was gentle, curious, and oddly kind, asking more about her art than her illness. Over time, his visits became more frequent. He'd bring coffee and sketchbooks, soup and pencils. More than that, he brought conversation, honest, human, healing conversation. He asked about Elsie's dreams, about the children's books Natalie once illustrated. He laughed at her wry humor, and he listened, truly listened, when she spoke about life before the hospital walls. What she didn't know was that Ned was actually Edward Langley, one of the wealthiest men in Britain. A man who could have afforded the best of everything, yet found himself lingering at the bedside of a woman who refused to accept handouts, who insisted on earning whatever she could, even from a hospital bed. He had watched Natalie face each day with quiet defiance, and he was in awe. There was no self-pity, no manipulation, just grace, even in suffering. One day, Edward returned with something unexpected, a publishing contract. He'd contacted a reputable children's publisher who had seen Natalie's old portfolio online. They were offering her a freelance deal, allowing her to work from the hospital and be paid for the magic she created with pencil and paper. Natalie held the contract in her shaky hands, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How did you?" she whispered. Edward only smiled. "Let's just say I know a few people." She tried to laugh it off, said she hadn't felt useful in a long time. Edward replied softly, "You've always been useful, you just forgot." But no amount of kindness could erase the truth. Natalie was dying. Her kidneys were failing fast, and her name on the transplant list brought little comfort. Time was running out, and her daughter Elsie was far too young to carry such a heavy future alone. So Edward, still known only to her as Ned, did the only thing his heart would allow. He quietly got tested to see if he was a compatible donor. The results were astonishing. Not only was he a match, he was a perfect one. But to proceed, He would have to reveal everything: his real name, his wealth, his influence. He would no longer be the man who just brought sketchbooks and listened quietly. He would be Edward Langley, CEO of Langley Systems, and he was terrified Natalie would feel betrayed, believe he had tricked her, or worse, pity her. That night, as she slept, he sat at her bedside, heart thudding. He picked up her sketch pad, turned to a blank page, and began to write. In his letter, Edward told Natalie everything: who he really was, why he came, how her courage and creativity had pulled him from the abyss, how she had reminded him what it meant to be human. He didn't write it for thanks or forgiveness. He wrote it because she deserved the truth and the choice. He ended with a promise: I got tested. I can give you my kidney, not because you need saving, but because you saved me first. Then he left the letter tucked between the pages and prepared for the surgery. The following morning, Natalie woke up to the news that a donor had been found and that her surgery was successful. She asked, "Who?" And the nurse hesitated, then finally told her, "Edward Langley," the man she knew as Ned. Shock swept over her. And yet when she opened her sketch pad and found his letter, read the words he had written with such raw, trembling sincerity, she didn't feel anger. She felt something far more powerful: gratitude, love, and an overwhelming sense of wonder that someone had chosen to see her, not just her illness, not just her poverty, but her. Natalie wept, not from sorrow but from hope, because for the first time in years, her life was no longer slipping away. It was just beginning. The days after the transplant surgery passed in a kind of quiet reverence. Edward Langley, once the elusive billionaire hiding behind boardroom doors and guarded penthouses, found himself grounded in something far more real than he'd ever known. He had given a part of himself, literally, to save Natalie Dawson. And though his body was healing, it was his heart that had transformed the most. For so long he had measured life in profit margins and milestones, yet none of it had prepared him for the way Natalie looked at him when she learned the truth. No bitterness, no accusation, just tears, soft and warm and full of gratitude. She'd held his hand in the recovery room and whispered, "You didn't have to be an angel, Edward. You just had to be you." And for once, that had been enough. Edward's decision to leave Langley Systems shocked the press and investors alike. Rumors spread, first whispers, then headlines, that he had undergone major surgery and had been seen visiting a small public hospital. But he offered no interviews, held no press conferences. His only statement was short and final: "It is time for me to live differently now." Then he disappeared. He sold the penthouse with its sweeping views of the Thames and retreated to a modest home in the countryside, just outside Oxford, where the air was quiet and the stars were visible. It wasn't grand by his old standards, but for the first time his home wasn't just a place, it was a life. Natalie moved in after her recovery, still a little frail but brighter each day, her laughter returning like birdsong after winter. Elsie ran barefoot through the back garden, climbed trees, painted fairy tale creatures in the shed, and called Edward Dad before he had the courage to accept it. Their days were simple, beautiful in their ordinariness. Edward cooked Sunday breakfasts while Natalie sketched at the kitchen table, and Elsie sprawled on the floor with picture books. The man who once lived in a world of numbers now spent his evenings helping Elsie plant lavender by the windowsill or reading drafts of Natalie's stories. Natalie's health, though still fragile, was stable. Her creativity bloomed with every passing week. She started writing again, more than just sketching, and filled notebooks with storylines inspired by her hospital stay, her daughter's courage, and the stranger who had walked into their lives on a snowy morning and never left. One afternoon, she handed Edward a stack of pages. "I think I'm writing our story," she said softly. He flipped through them, smiling. The chapters spoke of hope, loss, and second chances. There were no sweeping declarations, no grand gestures, just quiet moments, the kind that changed people. When he asked whether she'd publish it, Natalie hesitated. "Only if you let me dedicate it to you." That winter, Natalie's book, A Miracle Named Edward, launched in a quaint village bookshop. Locals gathered, sipping mulled wine and leafing through pages illustrated in her signature dreamlike style. The final image showed a girl in a woolen hat, flanked by two parents releasing paper lanterns into a starlit sky. No caption, none needed. The book quickly caught national attention. Not because it was scandalous or sensational, but because it was true. A love story not built on romance alone, but on kindness, healing, and the sheer power of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Inspired by the overwhelming response, Edward and Natalie launched Elsie's Wish, a foundation to support families awaiting organ transplants. What started as a small effort in their village soon spread across the UK, connecting donors and recipients, offering counseling and covering medical expenses for those in need. At the first annual Elsie's Wish event, Edward stood before a room full of families, doctors, and volunteers. But his eyes were only on Elsie, who wore a blue dress with stars and held a laminated £5 note in her hand, the one she'd once tried to give him for cleaning his car window. She stepped up to the microphone and said, "I thought he was a miracle, but he's not. He's just my dad, and he's everything I ever wished for." In that moment, as applause filled the hall, Edward knew this was what legacy meant. Not empires, not stock portfolios, but love that outlives circumstance. And as they stood hand in hand beneath the snow-covered sky that Christmas Eve, watching lanterns rise, he whispered, "We asked for a miracle, and we became one." Edward Langley had once believed that redemption came through achievement, through power, recognition, or the approval of people he would never meet. But as the months passed after Nancy's transplant, he began to see that the most profound transformation was not measured in headlines, but in the quiet ways his life had shifted. The sterile penthouse was gone. The urgent, endless meetings had stopped. And in their place was something far richer, the daily rhythm of a shared life. He awoke not to emails or boardroom agendas, but to the scent of coffee, the shuffle of little feet on wooden floors, and the soft sound of Natalie humming while she drew at the kitchen table. The man who once surrounded himself with glass and steel now planted herbs in the back garden, learned how to cook Lily's favorite shepherd's pie, and found peace in washing up after dinner by hand. Lily, once the little girl who cleaned windscreens in the bitter cold to save her mother, had blossomed into a spirited whirlwind of laughter and love. She no longer had to wish for miracles because she lived in the heart of one. Edward was no longer just her angel. He was her bedtime storyteller, her school-run driver, the man she proudly introduced as Dad at parents' evenings, even though there was no paperwork to make it official. At first, he had hesitated to embrace the title, unsure whether he deserved it. But one evening, after tucking her in, Lily looked up at him and said, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to stay." And in that moment, all the walls he had built began to crumble. Natalie, too, had been changing. With her health improving day by day, her creative energy returned with a force that surprised even her. She no longer just illustrated other people's stories. She began writing her own. Her first children's book, A Miracle Named Edward, told the story of love found in unexpected places, of hope that outlasted despair, and of a man who rediscovered his heart because a child believed in him. The book touched thousands not because it was overly sentimental, but because it was honest. It didn't romanticize illness or wealth or heroism. It told the truth, that real miracles often begin with someone showing up again and again when no one else will. The success of the book inspired the launch of Lily's Wish, a charity named after the little girl who had once scribbled her plea for help on a crumpled piece of paper. With Edward's backing and Natalie's storytelling heart, the foundation began matching transplant donors with patients, funding aftercare, and supporting single-parent families facing medical crises. In a quiet village town hall, they held their first fundraiser. Families lit candles for loved ones they'd lost, others shared testimonies of recovery, and children danced under a canopy of fairy lights. Edward stood at the front, no longer the guarded CEO, but a man with his sleeves rolled up, holding Lily's hand. He spoke not of corporate strategy, but of grace. The grace he had received from a little girl with a frayed cloth and a £5 dream, and from a woman who had taught him that strength is not loud, but steady. He ended his speech with simple words, "We don't have to be perfect, we just have to love." Later that evening, under a blanket of stars, the family stood by the lake near their home, releasing paper lanterns into the dark sky. One carried a message written by Lily in silver pen, "Thank you for choosing us." As the lantern floated higher, Edward wrapped an arm around Natalie and kissed the top of Lily's head. For the first time in his life, He felt whole, not because of what he had built, but because of what he had finally opened his heart to receive: family, belonging, and love that asked for nothing in return. This wasn't just a happy ending, it was a beginning, one born from the smallest gesture on a winter morning when a little girl dared to believe someone might be her miracle and unknowingly became his. For Edward Langley, love had never come easily. It was something distant, abstract, spoken of in stories or sold in marketing campaigns. But as winter softened into spring and life inside their quiet Oxfordshire home blossomed with light, he found himself encountering a new, quieter kind of love. It wasn't in grand gestures or declarations. It lived in the rhythm of ordinary days. It was Natalie sitting barefoot on the porch, sketchbook in her lap, humming softly to the sound of birds. It was Lily's laughter from the garden as she chased butterflies. It was the scent of pancakes on Sunday mornings, the way Natalie would rest her head on his shoulder during quiet moments, and how Lily would tug on his sleeve just to show him a bug she'd found in the soil. It was all the things he'd never known he needed, until they were his. He often marveled at how his world had shifted. A year ago, he had been the unreachable billionaire, holed up in a penthouse, tethered to a life of calculated success and emotional emptiness. Now he found himself crawling on the living room floor helping Lily build cardboard castles, or spending hours repainting the walls of Natalie's home studio just to give her the perfect light for drawing. There were no deadlines, no shareholders, only moments. Meaningful, fleeting, beautiful moments. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep curled up beside her favorite stuffed rabbit, Edward and Natalie sat on the back steps, sipping tea in silence. The stars above seemed closer than they ever had in London, and Natalie finally said the words that had lingered between them for weeks. "You've changed," she whispered, "but not in the way most people mean when they say it. You didn't become someone else. You just came home to yourself." Edward felt the truth of it land deep in his chest. He hadn't lost who he was. He'd simply been running from it for years. Their love didn't arrive like fireworks. It wasn't loud or urgent. It unfolded slowly with patience and mutual respect. It was Natalie allowing Edward to grieve the life he had left behind, and Edward giving Natalie space to rediscover her strength without ever trying to fix her. They talked late into the night about fears and dreams, childhoods and regrets. Natalie shared her story with unflinching honesty, the loneliness of being a single mother, the terror of facing death alone in a hospital room, and the guilt she had carried for not being able to give Lily more. Edward didn't interrupt or try to reassure her with promises. He simply listened, the way she had once listened to him. What bound them together wasn't pity or obligation. It was choice. A conscious decision to see one another truly, and to keep choosing each other even when things weren't perfect. And slowly, as weeks turned into months, Edward began to understand that love wasn't about finding someone who completed you. It was about finding someone who reminded you that you were already whole. Someone who made you braver, softer, more willing to stay. Natalie never asked him to adopt Lily, never pressured him to step into the role of father. But one night, as he read Lily her bedtime story, she climbed into his lap, rested her head on his chest and said, "You feel like home." That night Edward cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming joy of being seen, of being needed in a way that was pure and unconditional. And in that moment he knew this was his family, not by blood but by every other measure that truly mattered. Their love didn't need to be defined by labels. It existed in the silent understanding of two people who had survived heartbreak, loss, and solitude, and had still chosen to open their hearts again. It was real, imperfect, and stronger because of it. And for the first time in Edward's life, he understood what forever really meant. Not a promise of perfection, but the promise to keep showing up, to love, to grow, and to stay. It had started with just £5, a small act of kindness, born from a child's desperation and bravery. But in the end, what unfolded was not merely the rescue of a single mother and her daughter. It was the quiet rebuilding of three broken hearts, stitched together by love, sacrifice, and the belief that even the smallest light can guide someone home. Edward Langley had once believed he needed nothing and no one. He had the skyline, the silence of wealth, and the fortress of solitude built from years of grief. But now, sitting beneath a starlit sky beside Natalie and Lily, releasing glowing lanterns into the cold December air, he knew that what had once protected him had also imprisoned him. And it had taken a 5-year-old girl with chapped hands and a frayed cloth to show him the way out. Natalie, once frail and clinging to life in a sterile hospital bed, had been transformed. Her cheeks were now kissed by color. Her laughter echoed through the kitchen as she painted with Lily, and her eyes, once tired and dulled by pain, now sparkled with creativity and joy. The surgery had saved her body, but it was love that had revived her spirit. She no longer sketched alone in quiet corners. Now she illustrated stories about hope, about second chances, and about a man who came into their lives not to save them, but to remind them that they were already worth saving. For Lily, life no longer meant braving the cold to earn pennies in hopes of saving her mom. It meant dancing barefoot in the grass, drawing beside her mother, and being carried on Edward's shoulders through the village fair. She had believed in angels, in miracles, in the goodness of strangers. And because she believed, love found a way in. She had taught Edward the power of hope even when the world felt indifferent. The family they built wasn't bound by tradition nor by perfection. It was shaped in everyday acts, burnt toast that still made them laugh, bedtime stories read under blankets, quiet conversations about the past. They celebrated birthdays with handmade cards and early morning pancakes. And every evening they sat together grateful, not for the life they once imagined, but for the unexpected beauty of the life they now lived. 1 year after that freezing morning on the street, Natalie's book, A Miracle Named Edward, hit the shelves. It wasn't just a story. It was a love letter to the life they had built together. And that same winter, Lily's Wish Foundation held its first gathering, helping other families find the hope they once thought lost. Hundreds had written letters, sent drawings, shared stories of being seen, of receiving kindness from strangers who became family. In that small village church hall, as paper stars twinkled from the ceiling and laughter filled the air, Edward stood beside Lily and Natalie with quiet pride. He didn't speak as a CEO or philanthropist. He spoke as a man who had once been lost and was now found, not through fame or fortune, but through the unwavering love of a child and the grace of a woman who never asked for anything but honesty. The lesson that emerged was clear and powerful. Sometimes the miracle we seek isn't in grand gestures or answered prayers, but in the unexpected arrival of someone willing to stay. Love, after all, isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about holding each other through the dark and celebrating even the smallest victories together. Edward had once ruled a tech empire. Now his world was made of softer things, paint-stained fingers, laughter-filled kitchens, and lanterns drifting into the night sky. And in that glow he finally understood. Home wasn't a place, it was people, and he had found his. Life doesn't always hand us miracles wrapped in lightning bolts or lottery tickets. Sometimes they arrive as small hands tapping on a car window, or a crumpled note that reads, "Please God, send us a miracle." That was all it took for Edward Langley, a man buried beneath his billions, his grief and his silence, to realize that the truest wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch. And while Edward may have saved a life with his kidney, it was Natalie and Lily who saved his soul. In them, he discovered that strength isn't loud, it's quiet resilience. It's a little girl facing the cold with nothing but hope and a cleaning cloth. It's a mother sketching butterflies even when her hands tremble from illness. And it's the courage to love again when life has taught you to fear closeness. We often wait for life to change through circumstance, a new job, a new city, the perfect moment. But the real shift happens in the heart, when we choose to show up for someone else. Edward's journey from lonely CEO to devoted partner and father reminds us that the best parts of life aren't planned. They come when we least expect it. When we stop running, when we choose connection over control, and when we let go of the need to have all the answers. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You never know the weight someone carries, nor the light you might be for them. Be kind, look up, give your time, your patience, your compassion. Because sometimes, the smallest act of love is the miracle someone's been praying for. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Tell us about a moment when love or kindness changed your life. And if you believe in stories that heal, inspire, and bring us closer to what matters most, don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories. Because somewhere out there, someone's miracle is waiting, and it might just be you.